Right, welcome everyone. My name is Dennis Callahan. I am former policy debate captain at the Florida, captain of the University of Florida's debate team during the 2017 to 2018 school year. I was also one of the University of Florida speech and debate team chairs during the 2018-2019 school year. I have multiple tournament breaks in college policy debates, including breaks at the CETA National Tournament. And I'm here to talk to you about topicality. So before we actually dive into topicality, there's a couple of things that we want to talk about first. Specifically, what is the topic? So the topic for this year in high school policy debate is the United States federal government substantially increase its protection of water resources in the United States. Now, this topic has several different things that are relevant to topicality, obviously, but knowing the topic and the specific terms in a topic is the most important thing for policy affirmatives and policy negative teams looking to either run or defeat topicality in coming debate season. So, discussing the topic in general, this topic is saying that some branch, some arm of the United States federal government, any arm that is under its reach, can substantially increase. Now, substantially is not a well-defined term. Many different arguments in topicality come from that word substantially, but we'll get to that in a second. Substantially increase its protection. Note that that word is protection and not cleanup or any other types of terms like that. So not in, but of water resources. So this is not necessarily looking at just generally water that is used in energy or water that is in natural preserves. It is any water resources in the United States. So this cannot be a foreign topic. It is not going to be a topic that is focused on water abroad or of maritime law in general. Those are generally going to be atopical or extra topical. This is focused specifically on the protection of water resources in the United States. So, what is topicality in general? We've been sort of talking about the topic and looking at specific words, and you've said things like, oh, well, substantially is going to be a word, but what is topicality? Topicality is an argument run by the negating team in policy debate rounds that generally says the affirmative, you in this case, has proposed a plan that is outside the scope of this topic in one way or another, outside the scope of this year's resolution, somehow. There are plenty of ways that the negative can say that your argument is outside the scope of the topic. Let's say your plan is for many state governments to create a interstate department to cover water resources, let's say in the Kansas aquifer in the flyover states in the middle of the country. There's a large aquifer that spans from around Oklahoma all the way up close to Montana, and it spans a bunch of different states. And let's say your plan is for all those states to come together and create an interstate water resource management branch of their governments that all pitch in and all answer to this singular interstate entity. Well, that would be outside the scope of this topic, despite the fact that it's probably a good plan because of the fact that that aquifer is drawn upon by many different states for many different purposes, and the fact that they all draw on it unequally and without proper coordination at the moment, which is draining the aquifer faster than it can replenish itself. That plan is outside the scope of this topic. Because guess what? This topic says that the United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of water resources in the United States. That's not an action taken by the federal government. Your plan says that action is being taken by the state governments instead. So the negative can say Topicality, the affirmative is not using the federal government, and it can define the federal government, and it can say the multitude of states coming together and creating their own interstate water management. A branch of the government is not something being done by the federal government. They should have used the USFG instead. There's other ways that they can go about it. Let's say that your plan is for a specific town in your state to protect a specific lake in your town because that lake happens to be a very important source of natural habitat. Let's say in a park for some of the local wildlife. Well, they can say that's not a substantial increase in the protection of water resources in the United States. They could define substantial if they have the evidence to do so as meaning things like, it has to be relevant to a national level. Something like what we were talking about earlier with the interstate aquifer spanning from Oklahoma all the way up to near Montana. That would be substantial under their definition. They can give that example. And they can give that as a counter plan even if they wanted to. They could also create a counter plan, let's say, going back to our first affirmative for the Interstate Coalition for Water Resource Management. Let's say they create an alternative and they say the U.S. federal government should do the AF instead. That is a perfectly viable counter plan when you have specifically excluded the United States federal government. So there are affirmatives that do that, by the way, that specifically exclude the United States government despite this wording right at the start of the resolution. And you can do that if you have the evidence to say that the USFG getting involved in it is specifically bad. However, you have to be prepared for that topicality argument because they're definitely going to run it against you. They could say that what you're doing is not an increase. They could say that what you're doing keeps the status quo, in which case it just doesn't do anything, right? They would have to disprove the advantages that your affirmative has to make that topicality argument viable. In which case they just win because you're doing the status quo anyway. But that is still something that they can do. Or they can flip it and say, no, this is a decrease in the protection of water resources in the United States. They have disadvantages that say so. Not only do they win on the disadvantages, but they can also go for topicality, especially if your plan in general does something harmful to the environment as a byproduct of what it is supposed to do or what it intends to do. They can say that your plan is not protection. Let's look at some of these example arguments. I have this pulled up from the National Federation of State High School Associations. There are a few different ones. Protection, for instance. They can look at this term and say, no, protection requires legal regulations on actors to protect water, and direct actions on matters such as climate change are not topical. So they can say that you need protection specifically focused on water resources. You can't say, oh, we'll protect the climate overall and that will protect water resources. You have to specifically target water resources. They can say that protection denotes the prevention of contamination as opposed to the purification of water post-contamination. So they can say that you have to take preemptive action to prevent something rather than cleaning up something that's already happened. I think that's definitely going to be an argument that is run multiple times in this coming year. Protection can also involve preventing harm to water resources and not the use of water for desalination or bottling water or generating electricity with wave power or any other use of water in one way or another. So it's not the protection for use. It is specifically protection and prevention in general. So there are a lot of different types of topicality. Again, we're looking at increase, we're looking at substantially, more than 25%. We're looking at even should in some cases. I know there are some people who run topicality should, as much as I hated that argument. We looked at in as well. There's one in here. There we go. Protection of water resources mean preventing water pollution. Cases protecting living species in water are not topical. So it's not about the protection of species. That's an argument that the negative can make. So if you're looking at water resources as this sort of holistic idea of everything living in or about the water, they can say, no, that's extra topical. It's in addition to the scope of the usual topic. So with that in mind, there are a lot of different ways that the negative can say that the affirmative is atopical or extratopical or outside the scope of the topic. There are many different sources of evidence that they can pull from. There's many documents put together, just like this one that I'm showing right now, that already have lots of evidence and lots of different things to look at. I mean, you can scroll through this 16-page document and read all of this different evidence and put this into case files if you wanted to. And I got these through simple Google searches on the topic. I didn't have any evidence prepared on this. I found these in about 20 minutes. So you can and you should go ahead, Google the topic, Google topicality, Google definitions, and these sources popped up from the NFHS. So these are sanctioned sources. They are publicly available to you, and you should absolutely cut these cards so that you can have these ready to go for your topicality cases too. If I'm doing a lecture, I expect you to use it. So we're going to talk a little bit more about topicality as a structured argument and how topicality is usually run. You can say that an argument is not topical, but you have to actually understand how do I structure that argument, because just saying that it's not topical doesn't automatically win you the ballot. So let's return to what is an argument. So every basic argument, and you should know this, every basic argument starts with three things: claim, a warrant, and an impact. And these three things also make up a topicality argument. In general, the claim that they are making is that you have been outside the scope of the topic. And they can't just say, you're outside the scope of the topic. They have to have an interpretation and definition of the topic. And those usually come in the forms of that evidence that we were looking at earlier. This would be an interpretation of the topic. Protection of water resources requires preventing pollution of water. Cases protecting species living in water are not topical. So let's say I'm from Florida. I am from Clearwater, Florida right now. Red tide is a big issue around here. Let's say I have a case to get rid of the fertilizer industry in Florida, to ban fertilization to ban fertilizer plants and fertilizer factories along any coastlines in any state in order to help slow the spread of red tide. There have been studies that have linked the nitrogen released from fertilizer factories into the water to the increase in red tide incidence and to red tide severity in recent years. Let's say that's my affirmative. And I give some different examples. Let's say, moving more jobs into rural areas where the job market is scarce, moving more high-paying jobs inland so that people are able to afford housing, things like that. And I have an environmental advantage as well of preventing the increased severity of red tide. Well, the negative says, well, that's all well and good, but you are not protecting water resources. You are protecting species living inside the water. So they are saying that I'm not preventing the pollution of water. My advantage talks about the cases protecting species living in water. I'm talking about protecting fish. I'm not talking about preventing pollution or about making the oceans safer for anything or about protecting our water resources. So that's their definition and that's their interpretation of the topic. And now that's their claim here, typically. Now, the violation would be their warrant. Right? The violation in this case is the fact that my advantage is focused on the environment and the fish rather than the actual pollution going into the waters. And so they have their violation, and that's what they're sticking with. And now the impact. Notice I didn't change this one. You still have an impact in topicality. There has to be an impact for a judge to vote on your argument. I can make the argument that, oh, well, they don't talk about keeping nitrogen out of the water. They're talking about the effects of it on fish. and I can say nothing after that, and the judge wouldn't have a reason to vote on it, because I didn't give the judge a reason why it's important. So there are several ways to give the judge a reason why that's important. But let's talk about these as a structure. The interpretation and definition. Excuse me, I'm coming out of a little sickness. Typically, this is a very important point for topicality arguments. The impacts for topicality tend to be easy to make, and they tend to be very hard to defend against for the affirmative. So because of that, a lot of argumentation on topicality occurs up here and not down here. A lot of the argumentation for topicality occurs up here, and this is where your link chains are going to be. This is where you're going to be making a lot of analysis, and this is where you're going to be doing a lot of talking without cards and without evidence to back yourself up. On the impact, you're still going to be doing a lot of talking without evidence. You're going to have taglines instead for your impact. You might have some evidence, especially for those critical debaters, critical affirmatives. And we'll give some examples of those, as well as a couple of ways to go about that later on. Basically, for the negative, you want to prove your interpretation is reasonable, right? I can say all I want that this interpretation is what I'm sticking with, but I have to prove why this is reasonable. And reasonability can come in a multitude of different ways. You can have evidence that backs it up. This person right here definitely has it. See, water source protection involves the protection of surface water sources, lakes, rivers, man-made reservoirs, and groundwater sources, spring protection, dug well protection, and drilled well protection to avoid water pollution. So that is the definition of water resources, and it does not include, you'll notice in their definition, the oceans either. So this card is very well put against my case, because my case involves the protection of ocean waters, which is not a water resource in the United States, according to this evidence. My case would have ocean waters be a water resource, but this interpretation and this evidence does not have ocean waters as a water resource in the United States. Now, there definitely is room for argument there, right? You can definitely argue that, hey, the waters that are owned by the United States, that are patrolled by the United States, are definitely still USA water resources, and you can have that argument, but the affirmative would need to provide some evidence for that. So the negative has a basis for this interpretation, and it has a basis for the interpretation's reasonability with that evidence. So they've done their job for the most part. Usually you want to see your evidence be reasonable via evidence. Ooh. Now, the violation is usually a tagline. You usually get your violation from your interpretation. If you are not getting the violation from your interpretation, you're doing something wrong and you're wasting your effort. The entire purpose of you laying out this interpretation, putting down this evidence for a definition, and showing why it's reasonable is so that you can say, the affirmative didn't do that. They didn't do that. They didn't do what my evidence said was reasonable, so judge, you have to vote neg, because they're not being topical, right? So you usually prove the violation oftentimes by proving that your interpretation is valid and reasonable, and giving definitions and evidence to show that it is valid and reasonable interpretation. You can also generally use the AF's evidence against them here. Read the 1AC. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to say this before two ends get this under their heads, but it took me a long time. It took me a long time, that's for sure. Read the 1AC. Please read the 1AC. It is your most valuable tool as a negative debater. You are a 2N, and you have your 1NC going up and giving a speech on topicality. They should have lines pulled from the 1AC. They should have lines pulled from the 1AC already in the 1NC to show that, on other arguments as well, but for things like this, having evidence from the 1AC is so valuable. Because it shows directly that the AF is doing something that contradicts your definition, that violates your definition and interpretation of the topic. So if you have that evidence from the 1AC, it is so damning if you do it correctly. And that's not just true of topicality, true of almost any argument, any off-case position that you are going to make, true of on-case positions in general. Using the 1AC and their evidence against them is incredibly powerful and is a tool that good debaters use all the time. All the time. You really want to have that happen. The best debaters are going to have AFs where your on-case positions and many of your off-case positions can't pull lines. And that's just a thing. Excuse me, but for many novices, you are going to be able to pull evidence from their 1AC. You are going to be able to take cards from their 1AC and recut them in different ways to say they're doing something bad or they're doing this thing that violates our interpretation. Okay. So now, we come down to the impact, and this is not something that you can ignore. Typically, there are two basic impact arguments. Usually there's less evidence involved here. There are definitely cards out there, and I'm sure a lot of your coaches already have some cards on topicality evidence, specifically with regards to education and fairness. Everyone loves education and fairness. Our two favorite impacts in debate. Oh, brings me back. Brings me back. These are the two most common impacts in topicality and for good. They are very easy to articulate why there is an impact in those two sorts of areas. So let's start with education. Usually they're given in that order as well, which is why I'm starting with education. Affirmatives that are outside the scope of the topic leave the negative less prepared to properly test the affirmative. Right, and that makes sense, right? If the affirmative is outside the scope of the topic, it means that the negative is less prepared to deal with that affirmative. It means that they're generally not going to have a lot of evidence that that affirmative is a bad idea because they didn't expect to have to prepare for that, right? Well, you started talking about fish out in the ocean and nitrogen going into salt water. I wasn't expecting that. I was prepared for spring protection and dug well protection and drilled well protection and looking at water pollution in freshwater sources like lakes and rivers and man-made reservoirs. I wasn't prepared to talk about the oceans. And so all of my evidence for my disadvantages and my counterplans and my critiques isn't going to stick. I mean, I just don't have the links to be able to run my off-case positions like usual. And I don't have, a lot of on-case preparatory work done for this as well. So what this is saying, essentially, is that the affirmative is going to be tested poorly. There's a couple of different things that can lead to. Poor testing can lead to bad policymaking. Lots of debaters go on to be policymakers and lawmakers in some capacity. There is credence to this argument that poor testing leads to bad policy because when many debaters leave the argument room and become lawmakers, it leads to poorly researched affirmatives and poorly tested ideas coming out of the argument room. The ideas that you talk about in that argument room often shape what types of ideas you have about policy through a large span of your life. I can say that debate completely changed how I thought about USFG policy on a wide number of issues and how I thought about politics in general on a wide number of issues. So it does change how you think about things on a very deep level and a very personal level. And so if your ideas get shaped into ones that are, the idea for this argument at least, is that if your ideas get shaped into ones that are poorly tested in the argument room, and those things still stick with you, it means that when you go and implement them in the real world, we're now left with bad policy. Also leads to bad voting and bad direct action. In the same vein, regardless of whether you're a lawmaker or a voter or whether you are a protester, protesting directly or acting directly, whether in or outside the law, to effect change in your community, if you leave the argument room with these poorly tested ideas, so the argument for education as an impact goes, you are going to make bad decisions about which policies you support and which ones you are against. The tagline that is commonly repeated is that voting neg in this round discourages the affirmative from circumventing proper testing and creates better education overall in debate rounds. That education is important for the reasons that we have already talked about. Now we're going to go on to fairness. I know that I'm going on for quite some time. It's been about 25 minutes already, so bear with me. We are getting closer to the end of it here. We're going to talk about fairness. We're going to talk about some affirmative ways of dealing with topicality. We're going to talk briefly excuse me, on critical debate and critical affirmatives. And then we'll be done. So, second impact for fairness. Affirmatives have, and this is a very common spiel that I heard oh so often during my time in debate. Affirmatives have an infinite prep time for making one affirmative, whereas the neg has to prep for every possible affirmative before the start of the tournament. And affirmatives outside the scope of the topic create an unfair prep time advantage for the AF. Not only do they have that infinite prep time, Judge, but they're also using it to prepare topics that are outside the scope of what we as the negative expect to have to deal with. All we get because of this are topicality arguments, instead of all our disadvantages, counterplans, case arguments, and critiques. And the proof is in the links. Watch, none of our links are going to stick because they're all meant for topical affirmatives. They're going to shrug off all our links because their AF isn't even inside the scope of the topic. None of our links expected them to be dealing with nitrogen flowing into the oceans instead of anything to do with our freshwater resources. And this skews the topic to the AF. They create a coin flip debate environment where every team only ever wins by flipping affirmative. So the impact is that it is a completely unfair advantage to be negative, and that the worst teams can win by just flipping affirmative. So, excuse me. So essentially, there's this infinite prep time argument. And then there's this argument that all of their links none of the links will stick to an atopical AF. So all they're going to get are topicality arguments, and that means that we now have a coin flip environment. Okay. And I don't remember if high school policy debate still flips a coin for sides. I know that in college policy debate it is entirely 50-50. They no longer flip coins for choosing sides. Except in break rounds. So in break rounds you do actually flip a coin. In preliminary rounds you do not flip a coin. This argument does actually hold some credence if you buy the internal link chain up here, if you buy these internal links to it. So this impact does actually hold some credence in break rounds, especially if you buy the internal link chain. So those are the impacts generally that people go for when you're looking at topicality. It's an argument about the rules of debate at its heart. It's an argument about the rules of debate. It says that, hey, they broke the rules, we're playing a game in here, and they broke the rules, and they should lose because they broke the rules. You shouldn't reward them with a win just because they made good arguments if they're breaking the rules of the game to begin with. It's like letting somebody get a three-pointer by just traveling all the way across the court and then shooting a three-pointer. No, you call them on traveling over there, despite the fact that they still made a good shot. You call them on the traveling. Come on, right? The arguments there are, hey, they're going to take their basketball skills, they're traveling outside the court and they're going to teach other people the wrong way. Or, hey, they are winning by just like running with the ball and not dribbling at all and not giving us a chance to, make any steals or anything like that. So there are real world comparisons that you can make that help put this into context. But at the end of the day, Topicality compares the debate room to quote unquote a game where the rules have been broken by the affirmative and the negative should be winning because of that on the grounds that breaking the rules is bad for the game. So if you're the affirmative now, you got to think, oh, geez, well, that's a lot, isn't it? It is quite a lot. I'm gonna click. Okay, much better. All right, so now we are going to talk about being affirmative against topicality, and this is a very different sort of thing than being negative and running topicality. Basic rookie mistake when you are affirmative and against topicality is not providing a counter interpretation. Please provide a counter interpretation. When you allow the negative to dictate the only topic of interpretation throughout the round, you play into their evidence. They are going to have more evidence than you. If you only allow them to dictate the topic and its interpretation, provide a counter-interp so that they have to prove that their interpretation is better than yours. And not only that, they have to prove that your interpretation is unreasonable. Both interpretations can be reasonable, and the affirmative would still win topicality. Because as long as the affirmative's counter-interpretation is reasonable, and as long as they meet their own counter-interpretation, there is no reason for education or fairness to be lost. The reason why education and fairness get lost in a topicality debate is because of the fact that this interpretation was violated, because of the fact that the affirmative broke the rules of the game. If your interpretation shows that you still are playing by the rules of the game, if you are still meeting the topic as it was written by your evidence and by your interpretation, then it doesn't matter whether you violate the negative's interpretation. By your counter-interp, you are still playing by the rules. I'm going to abbreviate that CI from now on because it's long. That is step number one. If you don't do that, you have already lost. I don't care what the rest of your topicality argument is, you lost. You lost the mental game, you lost the prep game, you lost the line by line. You lost if you don't do this. Get it in your head, because when you have topicality run against you, the first argument you make is providing a counter-interpretation. The second argument you make is we meet. What does this mean? We meet. We meet what? We meet at dinner? No, we meet either or and. Both interpretations, one interpretation of the other, it does not matter. You're definitely going to say you meet the counter-interp, right? That's the whole reason you provide it. You provide a counter-interpretation of the topic, which you definitely meet 100% of the time, no matter how they try to spin it, right? My counter-interpretation would be that water resources include any water under the jurisdiction of the United States, right? And I would have some evidence that says that, yeah, the saltwater oceans are still our water resources because we get food from them, we fish from them, we get other resources from the oceans besides, stuff that we get from fresh water. Right, going back to my hypothetical affirmative of moving, nitrogen plants inland in Florida, moving fertilizer plants inland in Florida. So step 1 is provide a counter interpretation. Step 2 is say we meet. You can either say that you meet the counter interpretation, or that you meet the counter interpretation and the negatives interp. Now, the benefit to saying that you meet both is that you have 2 outs, right? Again, the reason why topicality has impact in the first place is because you broke the rules. Now, if you show you meet their interpretation, well, Judge, I didn't break any rules. Look, I meet their interp. I meet it. I didn't break the rules. So you don't need to vote on education and fairness. They should have anticipated this. I meet their interp under their definitions, though they should have had evidence for this, and it's their fault if they don't, and they should lose. Or you can say, well, Judge, even if I don't meet their interp, I still meet my own counter interp, and here's why my counter interpretation is reasonable. I've got evidence that says that the USFG controlled waters all count as water resources, so they should have been prepared for this. They should have known that somebody was going to run saltwater. I mean, shoot, I live in the state of Florida. Of course I'm going to run arguments based on the oceans. So, they should have... Basically, you're saying that I didn't break the rules. I meet these interpretations, and because I meet the interpretations, there's no rules being broken. There's no impact here. There's no link to a violation. Providing a counter interpretation is equivalent to providing a claim or providing a counter claim to their original claim of a different interpretation of the topic, right? And then providing we meet, or showing or saying that you meet either their interp or your counter interp or both, is equivalent to providing a warrant that you are correct in this case. It is the equivalent step 2 violation. And then the impacts. You can show their interp is bad. Under my interpretation, not only do we still get to talk about all of the issues regarding freshwater resources in the United States, including but not limited to the multitude of aquifer systems in the U.S., ranging from Florida all the way to Alaska, including glaciers in the U.S., also get to talk about saltwater issues, and I have clearly presented, Judge, a saltwater issue that should be addressed and should have something done about it by the USFG. It is valuable to our education that we talk about these issues. We only get domestic topics once every 4 years, Judge. So I don't know how it is in high school, but in college policy debate, we got a domestic topic once every 4 years. So, Judge, the wider the scope of the topic, the better. We need to talk about as many issues as possible because we only get this topic once every 4 years. And if we don't talk about it now, we're never going to talk about it again during our college careers. You can make this argument that their interpretation creates a narrow view of education on the topic that prevents you from learning the whole scope of the topic as it should be learned. That type of argument could lead to, turns on their education impact, saying, hey, who's creating the bad policy now? You're not even addressing any saltwater issues. You would just let whoever pollute oil into the saltwater, and we would never even talk about it. Right, that's a big issue, especially in the Gulf of Mexico, is oil pollution from either tankers tipping or from gas lines breaking. I mean, the Gulf of Mexico was literally on fire, not even a month ago? Come on. This is definitely something that should be talked about. So that type of turn on their education claims is something that you can do as the affirmative. You can also say, well, there's no impact if we don't, if we meet, right? Starting here shows that you don't even cause any of their bad impacts in the first place. These down here, this debate should either be turns, or if you're really shaky on your counterinterpretation or your we meet arguments, you can say, no, they're still going to be able to test us completely fine, and even if they don't test us completely fine, it's all a game in the first place. The fact that they're running topicality shows that they know it's a game, and it doesn't actually create bad policy or bad actors outside of the room. Also, they have topicality, so it is still fair if they are, able to win that we're not topical. Sure, you can vote us down, but there's no impact to voting for a topical affirmatives because we're still getting education on the topic anyway, and they are still able to run lots of critiques and other case files instead. So there are, defensive arguments that you can make on the impacts, but you really want to be making these offensive arguments instead. You want to be saying, hey, their interpretation creates the bad education. Their interpretation makes it unfair to the affirmative. The negative can run only 3 disadvantages or a couple counter plans a year and win every argument because they get as much prep time as they want on this very, very narrow sort of topic. You can also run arguments that talk about generally how I phrase this. You can also run arguments about how they get an equal amount of chances to run these affirmatives themselves, and because of that, the overall win rate for teams will even out to where it should be regardless. Again, that's a defensive argument. You want to be making turns if you can. Typically, you make turns by showing disadvantages to their interpretation. Okay. How much time do we have left here? Oh, we're looking at 40 minutes already. Okay. Let's go ahead and talk about critical affirmatives. Marna, if you are not covering critical affirmatives or if they haven't talked about them yet, you can cut me off here. In the case that you are cutting me off here, thank you all for watching. I hope that you learned quite a bit from this. If you'd like either my notes here in MS Paint or if you'd like my Word document on what I wrote up before this topic started, or if you'd like these documents, feel free to email me at dennis.callahan87@gmail.com. You can also ask Marna for my email address, but if you would like to speak with me generally about debate things, you can contact me. Just give me a subject line that tells me you were at Marna Weston's debate camp, and I will get back to you in as timely a manner as I can. I am employed full-time, and I do have several other hobby projects going on at the moment, but I will attempt to get back to you as soon as I can on it. Okay. The other thing that we would talk about is topicality against critical affirmatives. So, critical affirmatives do not try to be topical most of the time. I used to run critical affirmatives with most of my partners. I was a 2N, but I have been a 2A before. I have given 2 ACs and 2 ARs plenty of times, and on non-topical affirmatives. Affirmatives that were completely outside the topic, that did not even try to use the US federal government. And attacking topicality is a little bit different. Typically, they call it framework when they run. We're going to start off the framework. Now, the framework discussion typically starts off with a USFG interp. And it's pretty easy to see why. If your affirmative doesn't use the USFG, you're not topical. The difference is that most of these affirmatives don't even try to pretend. Right? I didn't try to pretend. I was like, yeah, through the USFG. I don't know the Marna language. I don't know. You know. So, we frequently ran arguments that ran completely counter to what the topic actually was. And we won on these arguments. And we won despite the fact that we were clearly breaking the rules of debate. Because in policy debate, if you can prove why it's a good idea, you're allowed to break the rules. That's the great thing about policy debate, is you can break the rules if you want to. The other team is going to tell you that you're wrong for breaking the rules, but as long as you have a good reason for it, breaking the rules is completely allowed. Right? You get to debate whether the rules are a good thing or not. And you can very often win rounds off of saying, no, the rules that force you to debate US federal government policy are a bad thing, and here's why. Oh, excuse me. Okay. Pure KF, the other way that you win topicality, or in this case framework, is by saying that the benefits of education for USFG policy is worse or is outweighed by the benefits to direct action. Typically, the way that critical affirmatives work is you are advocating for direct action on a related area, right? I might advocate for, and here is an affirmative that several Wake Forest University debaters ran when I was debating. They ran eco-terrorism on the climate change topic in 2016 and 20. And the argument was the U.S. federal government will not do anything about climate change. Turned out to be pretty true because Trump got elected that year. So, yeah, 2017 was wild on the climate change topic. We debated climate change while Trump was president. Um, and even while Biden was president, even when Obama was president, it wasn't looking like the USFG was going to do anything. So they said, yeah, USFG will not do anything, and in fact is actively advancing climate change. So we are going to take it into our own hands. We are advocating for the destruction of oil rigs. We're advocating for the destruction of factories that are heavy polluters. And they advocated for essentially eco-terrorism on domestic soil. And those types of arguments won rounds because they argued that, well, no, there is no benefit to debating about USFG policy when that education isn't going to change the reality of climate change. When that education is not going to change our reality outside of the argument room, who really benefits from that education? That is a premise that most critical affirmatives start with in the first place. Is the U.S. federal government isn't doing anything and is in fact actively harmful. That is a foregone conclusion if you are running a critical affirmative, and your responses to topicality and to framework have to operate under that assumption, or you are going to lose. You can also make the argument that education for white policymakers to advance the USFG agenda is actively harmful to the people that government marginalizes. I heard that argument made. I made that argument myself. It is very effective. You can also say that fairness is for whom? In round. If it's true that the United States federal government is actively harmful to a large swath of different populations, and that no matter what activities it undertakes, it is eventually going to be harmful to those populations with those activities, why is it fair that the only topics of conversation in the debate room should focus around the US federal government? That is an argument that you can make, is that it is unfair to create rules that force people to focus on the US federal government when they will never be benefited from actions taken by that government, when they only ever be harmed by actions taken by that government. You can also then make the argument that the ability to talk about direct action, whether it be something like eco-terrorism or whether it be something as simple as methods for survival, methods for adaptation to a coming climate crisis future, being able to talk about those things in the argument room in a safe space like debate is incredibly valuable to so many people. And the ability to talk about those things then is very valuable within that space in particular. So the creation of a rule set that does not allow those topics to happen, those topics of discussion to happen, actively excludes and is unfair to people for whom those topics are the only valuable topics to discuss. I got tired of writing print. Yeah, I believe I'm already at the end of my page. Okay. All right, and really the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the negative arguments against these affirmative arguments. You know, the neg can say that direct action belongs in critiques. Right, in negative critiques instead of in affirmative KFs. The negative can say that USFG policy can be good. Right, there are many different arguments that the negative can bring up with that and with framework arguments, but in general, you really want to focus on, if you are a critical affirmative, proving your thesis that the United States federal government is usually wholly bad. Most critical affirmatives start with that interpretation. Because if you don't, this argument that you can run your arguments on the neg, you can run your KF on the neg, counterplan, or as a critique, is usually pretty powerful. So usually you do have to start with a USFG isn't going to do anything that we are talking about in this room. Why are we talking about it? Type of argument. With that, I think that's just about everything that I have to talk about. If there is, once again, if there's anything that you would like to speak with me about personally, if you want my opinions on any of the things that you talked about during this camp, or if you want any of the resources that I put together for this document, if you want my notes from this, you can email me at dennis.callahan87@gmail.com. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much to Mr. Weston for inviting me to create this video lecture for you all. It was a pleasure.